People often think Christopher Columbus was the first European to reach America, but this isn't quite right. Europeans got there much earlier. Long before Columbus sailed, another group of Europeans made the long trip across the ocean. These were the Norse, also known as Vikings. They were skilled sailors and explorers. They came from places like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Their ships were famous. They could handle rough seas. They traveled far for trade, raids, and new lands to settle. The Vikings spread out in many directions. They went south to the Mediterranean. They sailed east into Russia. And importantly for our story, they went west. They crossed the North Atlantic. This was a huge journey, but they did it step by step. First, they settled Iceland. This was a big island in the middle of the ocean. It was a good place to live for a while. Then, from Iceland, they went even further west. They found Greenland. Eric the Red led many of them there. They set up colonies on Greenland. They built farms and houses. Life was hard in Greenland. The climate was cold. Resources were limited, but they stayed there for centuries. Greenland was a stepping stone. From its western shores, the next landmass was not too far. Sailors sometimes saw land to the west, or they heard stories about it. It was a new world unknown to most Europeans. This was North America. The Norse called it by different names. They called it Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. These names describe the land they found. Helluland meant stone land. Markland meant forest land. Vinland meant wine land, likely for berries that grew there. The Vikings were always looking for new places. They wanted more resources, they wanted land for their growing families, they were practical people. So discovering North America was a big deal. It offered timber, furs, and other things they needed. Their time in North America was not a big invasion. It was more a series of explorations and attempts to settle. These trips were difficult. They faced challenges from the land itself. They also met the people already living there. These were the indigenous peoples of North America. The Norse called them Skraelings. The story of these voyages is old. It comes from ancient tales. These tales were passed down by word of mouth for generations. Eventually, people wrote them down. These written stories are called the Sagas. They give us a picture of what happened. They describe the land, the people, and the journeys. They talk about who went there. And they tell a very specific story about a birth. A child was born in this new land. Well, this child was European. This birth is at the heart of our question. Was this child a Viking? And was this child the first European born in America? These are important questions. They change how we think about history. They show us that the connection between Europe and America started much earlier than many realize. The Norse had a real but brief presence on the continent. Their journeys opened a door. And through that door, a new life entered the world. The main stories about the Norse in North America come from two important texts. These are called the Saga of Eric the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders. They are part of a larger collection of stories known as the Icelandic Sagas. These sagas are ancient historical accounts, but they are also literature. They mix facts with storytelling. Sometimes they even blend in a bit of legend. Still, they are our best window into these early voyages. Historians have studied them for a long time. They try to figure out what is true and what is embellishment. Both sagas tell a similar tale. They talk about the discovery of a new land west of Greenland. The Saga of the Greenlanders tells of Bjarni Hrdalsson first. He was a merchant. He got lost on a voyage from Iceland to Greenland. He saw land to the west, but he did not go ashore. He just kept sailing to Greenland. When he told his story, people became curious. Later, Leif Erikson heard about Bjarni's discovery. Leif was Eric the Red's son. This Eric the Red was the one who settled Greenland. Leif decided to explore this new land. He bought Bjarni's ship. He gathered a crew. And he set sail west. Leif Erikson found 3 distinct areas. He named them Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. Helluland was likely Baffin Island. It was rocky and barren. Markland was probably Labrador. It was covered in forests. This was important. Greenland had few trees for timber. Vinland was further south. It was a place with milder weather. The sagas say there were wild grapes there. That is why it was called Vinland or Wineland. Leif and his crew built some shelters there. They explored the land. They spent a winter there. Then they sailed back to Greenland. Leif did not try to set up a permanent settlement. After Leif, other Norse tried to go to Vinland. They wanted to explore more, they wanted to get resources, and some wanted to settle there. One of the most detailed accounts is about Thorfinn Karlsefni. He was a wealthy Icelandic merchant. He came to Greenland. He married Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir. She was Eric the Red's daughter-in-law. Gudrid was a strong and adventurous woman. Karlsefni decided to lead a large expedition to Vinland. He wanted to start a colony. This was a serious undertaking. It was not just a quick trip. Karlsefni took 3 ships. He brought about 160 people. This included men and women. They also brought livestock. They had cattle, they had sheep, they wanted to farm in Vinland, they sailed to Leif's old camp, which they called Leifsbudir. They stayed there for some time. They built houses, they traded with the local people, the Skrælings. They exchanged furs for milk and cloth. But their interactions were not always peaceful. There were conflicts. The sagas describe battles between the Norse and the Skrælings. During this expedition, a very important event happened. It is explicitly mentioned in both sagas. Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir gave birth to a son. They named him Snorri Thorfinnsson. The sagas are clear on this point. Snorri was born in Vinland. This makes him the first known European child born in North America. His birth is a key moment in the history of European contact with the continent. It shows that the Norse were not just explorers, they were also attempting to create a new life there. They were planting roots. Snorri's birth shows a level of commitment. It suggests a serious effort to settle. People do not usually have children in a place where they only plan to stay for a few months. His birth means that the Norse women were part of these trips. They were not just men seeking adventure. They were families trying to make a home. This makes the claim of first European child very specific to Snorri. His story is not just a passing mention. It is an integral part of the Vinland sagas. And it is the main reason why we even ask this question today. The sagas gave us the name. They gave us the time, they gave us the place, even if that place was broadly defined as Vinland. For a long time, these stories were just old tales. No one knew if they were truly historical. Then something changed. Archaeology stepped in. It started to provide answers. For a long time, the sagas were just stories. Historians read them. They found them fascinating, but there was no physical proof. No one knew exactly where Vinland was. Some people thought the sagas were just myths. They believed the tales of voyages to North America were made up, or they were exaggerated. This made it hard to prove that Snorri Thorfinnsson was really the first European child born in America. Without solid evidence, it remained a strong possibility, but not a certainty. Then, in the 1960s, something incredible happened. A husband and wife team, Helgi Ingstad and Anne Steiningstad, started looking for evidence. They were Norwegian explorers and archaeologists. They followed clues from the sagas. They focused on Newfoundland and Canada. This area matched some of the descriptions of Vinland. It had a mild climate compared to Greenland. It had trees, and it was a reasonable sailing distance from Greenland. Their search led them to a small fishing village. It was on the northern tip of Newfoundland. The village was called Meadows. Local people there showed them some overgrown mounds. These mounds looked like old house foundations. The Ingstads began to dig. What they found was amazing. They uncovered the clear remains of a Norse settlement. They found the foundations of 8 buildings. These included large halls. They were similar to ones found in Greenland and Iceland. They also found a smithy. This was a place for working iron, and they found a carpentry workshop. These buildings were clearly not indigenous structures. They were distinctively Norse. Even more important were the artifacts they found. They discovered a bronze pin. This pin was used to fasten cloaks. It was definitely Norse. They also found a stone lamp. And they found a spindle whorl. A spindle whorl is a small weight used for spinning wool into yarn. This was crucial. It showed that women were present at the site. This detail strongly supported the saga accounts. The sagas mentioned women, like Gudrid, being part of the Vinland expeditions. The carbon dating of the artifacts and building remains confirmed the time period. The settlement dated back to around 1000 AD. This was exactly when the sagas said the Norse voyages to Vinland happened. It lined up perfectly with Leif Erikson's time. This discovery was huge. It was the first undeniable archaeological proof of a Norse presence in North America. It proved that the sagas, at least in their broad outline, were true. Europeans did reach America centuries before Columbus. Lands os Meadows isn't necessarily Vinland itself. Vinland might have been a larger region. It might have been further south. The sagas describe grapes, and grapes don't usually grow as far north as Lands os Meadows. But Lands o Meadows was definitely a Norse outpost. It was a base camp. From there, they could explore Vinland. It was a place where they could repair ships, they could gather resources, they could live for a time. It gave the sagas a real place on the map. It turned the stories into verified history. This discovery changed everything for the question of the first European child. It provided the missing physical evidence. It showed that Norse people, including women, lived for periods in North America. They lived there at the exact time Snorri Thorfinnsson was supposed to have been born. While Meadows doesn't have a plaque saying Snorri was born here, it makes his story much more believable. It puts a solid foundation under the saga accounts. It tells us that these were not just tall tales. These were records of real events. So, with the sagas and archaeology in hand, we can directly address the question. Was Snorri Thorfinnsson truly the first European child born in America? The answer leans heavily toward yes. The evidence is strong, even if we don't have a modern birth certificate for Snorri. First, the sagas are very clear. Both the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders mention Snorri's birth. They state it happened in Vinland. They give his parents' names Thorfinn Karlsefni and Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir. This consistency across independent ancient texts is important. These weren't fleeting mentions. His birth was a noted event in their family history. It was part of the story of the Vinland attempts. This makes his birth a central point, not a side note. Second, the archaeological discovery at Meadows supports the entire context. Before Meadows, the sagas were just narratives. They were compelling, but unconfirmed. After the discovery, the sagas gained immense credibility. We now know that Norse people did travel to North America. They did build settlements, they did live there around 1000 AD. We know that women were part of these expeditions because of things like the spindle whorl found there. If Norse women were there, and a substantial group of people like Karlsefni's expedition spent years in Vinland, then a birth is a very natural and expected event. It would be stranger if no child had been born during these attempts at settlement. Third, there are no other credible claims for an earlier European birth in America. No other historical texts or archaeological findings suggest any other European group reached North America before the Norse. And certainly no other group has a recorded birth from that time. The Norse were truly the first known Europeans to establish any kind of presence on the continent. This means that if any European child was born there, it would have to be during their time. And Snorri is the only one explicitly named and recorded. Some might argue that the sagas have legendary elements. This is true. They are not dry historical documents in the modern sense, but they record real people and real events. The core events, like the voyages to Vinland, have been proven true. The birth of Snorri is a specific detail within those proven events. It is not an embellishment that sounds like a myth. It is a simple, factual statement about family life in a new land. After the Norse left Vinland, Snorri and his family returned to Greenland. Later, Gudrid, his mother, went on a pilgrimage to Rome. Snorri himself became a prominent figure in Iceland. He had a family. His descendants include many important people in Icelandic history, including bishops. This shows that Snorri was a real person. He was not a fictional character. His lineage is well documented in Icelandic sagas and family histories. This adds further weight to the truth of his birth. It connects him directly to the real world, far beyond the initial Vinland story. So, while we cannot definitively say, yes, 100%, without a shadow of a doubt, the historical and archaeological evidence strongly points to Snorri Thorfinnsson being the first European child born in America. He was born around 1005 AD. This happened centuries before Columbus. And yes, his parents were Vikings, or at least Norse people from Greenland and Iceland, part of the Viking Age culture. So the answer to the question is yes. Very likely the first European child born in America was a Viking. The Norse presence in North America was short-lived. They came, they explored, they even had a child born there. But they did not stay. They never established a lasting colony. This often leads to another question: why? Why did these determined explorers, who had successfully settled Iceland and Greenland, fail to make Vinland their permanent home? Several factors contributed to their withdrawal. One major reason was the indigenous population. The sagas refer to them as Skrælings. The interactions between the Norse and the Skrælings were complex. Sometimes they traded peacefully, the Norse traded red cloth for furs, but often the interactions turned hostile. The Skrælings greatly outnumbered the Norse. They were well armed with bows and arrows. The sagas describe several violent clashes. The Norse, with their limited numbers, found it hard to defend themselves and their settlements. They faced constant threat. They were far from home. These conflicts made life very dangerous for any potential settlers. It made it too risky to stay. Another big challenge was the sheer distance. Vinland was incredibly far from the Norse homelands. Even Greenland was a long way. Iceland was further still, and Norway was even further. Maintaining supply lines across the North Atlantic was extremely difficult. It was dangerous. It took a lot of time. Ships could get lost or damaged. This meant that any settlement in Vinland would be largely self-sufficient. But they couldn't just pack everything they needed to start a new civilization, they needed ongoing support. This isolation was a huge barrier. The limited number of Norse settlers was also a problem. Karlsefni's expedition, the largest, had about 160 people. This is not enough to found a thriving colony. They needed more people to clear land, build, farm, and defend themselves. Compared to the indigenous populations, their numbers were tiny. They couldn't expand. They couldn't establish many outposts. They were always on the defensive. The environment, while described as milder than Greenland, still presented challenges. Clearing land was hard work. Building homes and farms required immense effort. They were also looking for specific resources like timber and possibly grapes. But these were not enough to outweigh the risks and difficulties. Their primary goal seems to have been more about resource gathering and exploration than full-scale colonization. They brought back timber to Greenland, where trees were scarce. They gathered other goods. But the difficulties of permanent settlement outweighed the benefits. Internal conflicts also played a role. The sagas mention disagreements among the Norse themselves. There were arguments over leadership. There were quarrels between different families. These internal feuds weakened their cohesion. They made it even harder to face external threats. A unified front was essential for survival in a new and challenging land. They did not have it. So, after only a few years, Karlsefni's expedition decided to leave Vinland. They sailed back to Greenland. They took Snorri with them. The dream of a permanent Norse settlement in North America faded. The Norse continued to sail to Markland, the forested land, for timber for some time. But these were temporary resource trips. They were not attempts to settle. Eventually, even these trips stopped. The Norse presence in North America ended. Despite its brevity, this period is incredibly important. It shows that the Europeans did not just discover America in 1492, they had been there centuries before. The Norse voyages represent a fascinating chapter in human exploration. They prove that determined sailors could cross the vast ocean long before modern navigation. And the birth of Snorri Thorfinnsson means that for a brief time, a new life, a European life, began on the shores of America. He stands as a quiet but powerful symbol of that early connection. He was indeed very likely the first European child born in America, a child of the Viking Age.